Racist cops smash a black kid until his face turns red, unaware his father is Deadliest Delta Comman. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Oak Hill's manicured lawns as Marcus Holloway adjusted his gym bag over his shoulder. Taking this shortcut through the affluent neighborhood shaved 15 minutes off his walk home from basketball practice, though the stares from residents behind curtained windows never failed to follow him. At 17, Marcus had grown accustomed to being watched. 6'2" with broad shoulders and dark skin made him suspicious in places like this, despite the private school uniform he still wore beneath his unzipped hoodie. Before I go on, I would really appreciate it if you give this video a like, click the subscribe button down below. It would really encourage me to create more videos for you. Thank you so much. Alright, let's continue. Two police cruisers rounded opposite corners simultaneously, their approach too coordinated to be coincidence. Marcus felt his heart rate spike but kept his pace steady, remembering his father's instructions. No sudden movements. Keep your hands visible. Speak clearly and respectfully. The cruisers accelerated, cutting across the street to box him in from both directions. Before Marcus could process what was happening, four officers emerged with hands already on their weapons. On the ground. Now. The command came before any introduction, before any question about who he was or what he was doing. Marcus began to lower himself, palms raised in surrender. I live just 3 blocks south, sir. I'm just walking home from. A boot between his shoulder blades cut his explanation short, driving him face first into the pavement. The impact split his bottom lip instantly. Marcus tasted copper as rough hands wrenched his arms behind his back, the officer's knee pressing between his shoulder blades with unnecessary force. Got another one casing houses, an officer said into his radio, though Marcus had merely been walking on the sidewalk. Matches the description. There had been no description, just a black teenager in an expensive neighborhood. From his position against the concrete, Marcus could see a neighbor across the street, beginning to record with her phone. Others emerged from nearby homes, their expressions ranging from concern to morbid curiosity. No one intervened as an officer pressed Marcus's bleeding face harder against the ground, seemingly annoyed by his lack of resistance. You got something to say? The officer growled, noticing Marcus attempting to speak. The cold metal of handcuffs bit into Marcus's wrists as he tried to control his breathing. The officer's knee shifted to his neck, applying pressure that sent panic coursing through his body. Marcus had watched the news. He knew how these situations could end. Through restricted breath, he managed 3 words. Call my father. You hear that? Kid wants his daddy. One officer laughed, pulling Marcus roughly to his feet. Blood dripped from his split lip onto his white school shirt. His left cheekbone throbbed where it had struck the pavement. Another officer patted him down with deliberate roughness, emptying his pockets onto the street. School ID, phone, wallet, house keys. They ignored his school identification, focusing instead on the $20 in his wallet. Where'd you get this money, boy? The question came with another shove against the cruiser. Marcus winced as his already injured face pressed against the vehicle's cool metal surface. Basketball stipend, sir, he answered evenly, fighting to keep his voice from shaking. I'm on scholarship at Westridge Academy. The officers exchanged glances, clearly doubting that someone like him could attend the prestigious private school. As they prepared to force him into the back of the patrol car, Marcus raised his voice just enough to be heard by the growing crowd of onlookers. My father is Colonel James Holloway, Pentagon Special Operations Command. The officer holding his arm hesitated momentarily, his grip loosening for just a second before tightening again. Sure he is, kid, he replied, but Marcus caught the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. And my dad's the president. They shoved him into the back seat, his face now covered in blood, unaware their lives had just intersected with the son of one of the deadliest and most decorated military operators in American history, a man who had toppled dictatorships with fewer resources than his son's cell phone contacts list. As the cruiser pulled away, Marcus noticed his phone's screen lighting up on the ground where the officers had dropped it, displaying an incoming call from Dad. The first domino had fallen. Colonel James Holloway stood motionless at the head of the Pentagon briefing table, his weathered face betraying nothing as junior officers filed out. 26 years in special operations had taught him to compartmentalize, to lock away emotion in a place where it couldn't interfere with decision-making. At 52, he commanded respect without raising his voice, his reputation secured through 3 decades of missions that would never appear in history books. The last analyst had just closed the door when his secure phone vibrated against his hip. The caller ID showed Helen Mercer, his neighbor who watched for Marcus when James was deployed. He answered with military brevity, "Holloway." The panic in Helen's voice sliced through his practiced calm. "James, they've taken Marcus. The police, they hurt him. I'm sending you the video now." His second phone chimed with the incoming file. The colonel's expression remained unchanged as he watched his son's face pressed into concrete, blood pooling beneath his cheek. Only those who knew him well would notice his trigger finger tapping rhythmically against his thigh, the only external sign of the rage building within. "Where?" A one-word question carrying the weight of promised consequences. Helen provided the details while James calculated response time, resources, and contingencies, the same process he used before high-stakes operations. As he ended the call, Lieutenant Colonel Rivera approached, stopping short when he saw what played on James's phone. "Sir?" The question hung in the air. James tucked both phones away, his movements deliberate. "Family emergency. Clear my schedule." Rivera nodded, recognizing the controlled fury in his commander's eyes. No further explanation needed. In his office, James made 2 calls. The first to Police Commissioner Reynolds. They'd served together in Afghanistan before Reynolds traded desert camouflage for a blue uniform. "David, your officers just assaulted my son. Marcus Holloway, 17 years old, walking home from basketball practice." Silence stretched across the line before Reynolds spoke. "Where?" The same question James had asked minutes before. The same deadly calm. "Precinct 12 by now. I have video. Multiple videos. You understand what happens next depends entirely on your next move." The second call went to Major Elise Washington, now a civil rights attorney whose law degree had been funded by the military after 3 tours under James's command. She answered on the first ring. "Colonel, some habits never faded. Marcus has been taken by police. Excessive force. I'm texting you the precinct information. Meet me there in 30 minutes. Washington's response was immediate, bringing a team. "We'll need medical documentation of his injuries." James ended the call and crossed to the bathroom, where he splashed cold water on his face. Staring into the mirror, James saw Catherine in Marcus's features, his late wife's gentle eyes, her determined chin. The memory of her funeral 7 years ago resurfaced. 12-year-old Marcus standing impossibly straight in his too large suit as his father had taught him, accepting folded flags from white-gloved hands. Catherine had understood what James was building in their son, not just strength, but the strategic patience to use it wisely. "He'll need both in this world," she'd said once, watching Marcus navigate playground politics as the only black child in his class. James changed into his class uniform, every medal and ribbon in place, not vanity but calculation. Symbols carried weight. Authority responded to authority. As he affixed his Special Forces insignia, he recalled teaching Marcus how to handle police encounters. "Keep your hands visible. Address them as sir or officer. Don't argue, even when they're wrong." Advice that had failed his son today, as it had failed countless others without powerful fathers. The drive to the precinct took 18 minutes. James used 15 of them reconstructing the incident from Helen's video, identifying each officer's face and name badge. The final 3 minutes he spent doing what he'd done before every mission, emptying himself of everything but cold purpose. By the time he parked, Colonel Holloway had transformed into the man enemy combatants had learned to fear, methodical, focused, and inexorable. Commissioner Reynolds was already waiting outside, standing ramrod straight beside a visibly nervous captain. So was Washington, flanked by 2 associates carrying briefcases. No words were exchanged as the group moved toward the entrance, just a current of purpose flowing toward its inevitable conclusion. As James reached for the door, his phone chimed with a text from an unknown number. "We have building security footage showing Marcus did nothing. Sending now." The message was signed Sergeant Willis, Precinct 12. Even inside corrupt systems, allies could be found. James Holloway entered the police station with the same expression he'd worn breaching compounds in Kandahar and Mosul. The look of a man who had never failed to complete a mission, and who wasn't about to start now. Behind him followed the machinery of consequence, set in motion by officers who had no idea who they'd targeted, or what forces they'd awakened. The station's front desk fell silent as the group approached. The reckoning had arrived. Officer Brendan Miller leaned back in his chair, boots propped on the desk as he completed the arrest report. Suspicious activity, resisting arrest, possible connection to neighborhood burglaries. The fabrications flowed easily onto the form. Across from him, his partner Ramirez scrolled through Marcus's unlocked phone, smirking at private messages. Kid goes to Westridge. Probably dealing to rich kids. Their laughter echoed through the bullpen, drawing approving nods from fellow officers. No one questioned the blood-stained booking photo, or the refusal of medical attention for the teenager, now sitting silently and holding cell 3. Desk Sergeant Willis observed from his station, jaw tightening as he studied the surveillance feed showing Marcus sitting perfectly still, blood dried on his face. 23 years on the force had shown Willis how the system protected its own, but something about this arrest felt different. The boy's composure, his single phone call request denied, the mention of a military father, it didn't sit right. Willis's nephew was Marcus's age, played against Westridge Academy last season. That's the point guard, he'd realized with creeping dread. While Miller boasted about teaching the kid respect, Willis slipped into the file room, extracted the external camera footage, and sent it to a number he'd found in the boy's confiscated phone. Captain Hargrove burst from his office, unusually pale. "Commissioner's here. With company." The bullpen's casual atmosphere evaporated as officers straightened uniforms and closed social media tabs. Miller hurriedly wiped Marcus's blood from his knuckles with a tissue. "What's the big deal?" he muttered, though something in the captain's expression silenced further complaints. Through the glass walls, they watched a procession approach. Commissioner Reynolds at the front, followed by a tall black man in full military dress whose chest displayed rows of decorations even Hargrove, an Army veteran, couldn't fully identify. "Which officers arrested Marcus Holloway?" The commissioner's voice carried unusual tension as he entered the bullpen. Miller and Ramirez raised their hands with diminishing confidence. "Cell 3, Hargrove provided quickly." The colonel moved without waiting for permission, officers instinctively clearing a path. Through the holding area window, James Holloway laid eyes on his son for the first time since morning breakfast. Marcus sat with military posture despite his injuries, eyes forward, betraying no weakness. Pride and fury warred within the colonel as a medical examiner from Washington's team photographed his son's injuries through the glass. "Release him. Now." The commissioner's order sent a clerk scrambling for keys. "Those officers' body cameras, cell phone videos, security footage, I want it all preserved." As Marcus emerged from the cell, the department's nervous energy shifted to stunned silence. The boy didn't rush to his father, didn't display relief or fear. Instead, he stood at parade rest, the stance of someone accustomed to protocol even in crisis. Only when James placed a hand on his shoulder did Marcus allow the slightest tremor to pass through his frame. "You maintain discipline," the colonel said quietly. The words carried more weight than any emotional outburst could have. Washington positioned herself between her client and the arresting officers. "We'll need a private room for preliminary statements before Marcus receives medical attention." Her tone made clear this wasn't a request. Captain Hargrove gestured toward the conference room, awareness of the situation's gravity finally setting in. As the legal team established position, Commissioner Reynolds addressed the increasingly uncomfortable officers. "Body cameras. Now." Miller and Ramirez exchanged glances. "Sir, there was a malfunction." Reynolds cut him off. "Save it. They upload automatically to the server. I've already accessed the footage. Before I go on, I would really appreciate it if you give this video a like, click the subscribe button down below. It would really encourage me to create more videos for you. Thank you so much." "Alright, let's continue." Inside the conference room, Marcus recounted the incident with military precision, times, locations, exact quotes, while medical personnel cleaned his wounds. The colonel remained standing, reviewing footage on a tablet provided by Washington's associates. The body cameras had indeed captured everything. The deliberate targeting, excessive force, racist comments between officers, and most damning, Miller saying, "These rich neighborhoods need to know we keep certain elements out," while Marcus lay handcuffed on the ground. Commissioner Reynolds entered as the medical examination concluded. "Colonel Holloway, Ms. Washington, the mayor is requesting your presence." Media's gathering outside. The commissioner's career practiced neutrality couldn't hide his disgust as he added, "Officers Miller and Ramirez are being detained for falsifying reports. Captain Hargrove has been relieved pending investigation." James nodded, helping Marcus to his feet. "We'll need a formal uniform," he told Washington, who produced a garment bag containing Marcus's Westridge blazer. the school crest prominent on its breast pocket. The message was clear. Marcus would face the cameras not as a victim, but as who he truly was, a scholar, an athlete, a young man of discipline who had been judged solely by his skin. As they prepared to exit, Sergeant Willis approached with Marcus's belongings. "I'm sorry," he said, addressing the boy directly. Marcus studied the officer before accepting his phone and wallet. "You did something," he observed quietly. Willis nodded once, meeting the colonel's evaluating gaze. "The system works when good people refuse to be silent," James replied, extending his hand to the sergeant. The small gesture, witnessed by the entire precinct, drew a clear line between those who abused power and those who honored their oath. As the group moved toward the waiting press conference, officers throughout the building began removing themselves from the thin blue line that had protected Miller and Ramirez, recognizing that today, at least, accountability had found its way inside their walls. The precinct steps had transformed into an impromptu stage, microphones clustered like metallic flowers beneath the afternoon sun. Mayor Garrison stood at the podium, his practiced crisis smile betraying nervous energy as camera shutters clicked in rapid succession. "I've called this press conference to address an incident that occurred today involving our police department and a young resident." His carefully neutral phrasing drew murmurs from the assembled reporters, who had already received clips of the arrest from anonymous sources. The mayor's eyes repeatedly darted to the precinct doors, awaiting the procession he knew would redefine his political future. When Colonel Holloway emerged with Marcus at his side, the crowd's reaction was immediate. Gasps at the teenager's visible injuries, followed by a momentary hush as they registered the military uniform beside him. James guided his son with a light touch on the elbow, Washington and her team creating a protective formation around them. Commissioner Reynolds followed, maintaining professional distance, a visual separation from the department he now understood required fundamental reconstruction. The mayor stepped aside with poorly concealed relief, surrendering the microphone to a crisis he hadn't created, but would ultimately be judged for handling. "My name is Colonel James Holloway, United States Army Special Operations Command." The statement alone carried weight, but the visual of his uniform, adorned with combat ribbons, jump wings, and the distinctive insignia of units most civilians wouldn't recognize, established authority no elected official could match. "This is my son, Marcus Holloway, a junior at Westridge Academy, first chair cellist in the Youth Symphony, starting point guard for his basketball team." Each achievement landed deliberately, dismantling the narrative officers Miller and Ramirez had attempted to create. 3 hours ago, he was walking home from practice when he was assaulted by officers of this department. Behind the colonel, a projection screen came to life, displaying synchronized footage from multiple angles, security cameras, body cameras, bystander phones. No narration accompanied the visual evidence, allowing the brutal imagery to speak for itself. Marcus stood, motionless as his trauma played out for public consumption, chin lifted slightly, embodying his father's composure. Only Washington noticed his fingers trembling at his sides, reaching subtly to steady his hand with her own. The footage concluded with Miller's unambiguous statement about keeping certain elements out of wealthy neighborhoods, followed by Ramirez laughing as they drove away, leaving Marcus's school ID and phone on the pavement. "Today, my son experienced what countless young men without powerful parents endure without resolution." The colonel's voice remained measured, but carried to every corner of the crowded square. "The difference is not what happened to Marcus, but what happens next." At this cue, uniformed officers emerged from the precinct, escorting Miller and Ramirez in handcuffs. The symbolism was unmistakable. The same restraints they had placed on Marcus now encircled their own wrists. Captain Hargrove followed separately, not cuffed but clearly under supervision, his command insignia already removed from his uniform. Commissioner Reynolds approached the microphone, standing shoulder to shoulder with Colonel Holloway in a deliberate show of alignment. "Officers Miller and Ramirez have been terminated from the department and are being charged with assault, filing false reports, and civil rights violations." The announcement triggered a flurry of photography and shouted questions. "Captain Hargrove has been suspended pending investigation into supervisory failures. These actions represent not just individual misconduct, but systemic problems this department must address." His career suicide continued with each word, yet Reynolds spoke with the conviction of a man who had rediscovered his original purpose. Marcus stepped forward when his father gestured, taking the microphone with hands steadier than they had been moments before. The crowd hushed, cameras focusing on his injured face. "I did everything I was taught to do." His voice, though quieter than the colonel's, carried moral authority no adult present could claim. "Hands visible." "Yes, sir, no, sir." "Complete compliance." A photographer captured the moment his composure briefly cracked, revealing the 17-year-old beneath the stoic exterior. "It made no difference. I was never seen as a student or an athlete. Just a threat." The simplicity of his testimony silenced even the most hardened reporters. Washington stepped forward next, outlining the legal actions already in motion, not just against individual officers, but against department practices and training protocols. Behind her, a row of military officers in dress uniforms had materialized, colleagues of Colonel Holloway who had arrived without summons, standing at parade rest in silent support. Their presence communicated that this response extended beyond one powerful father. It represented institutional weight aligning against institutional failure. The optics were devastating for city leadership, who suddenly found themselves outmatched in rank, resources, and moral standing. As the formal statements concluded, reporters surged forward with questions. The mayor attempted to regain control of the narrative with practiced phrases about isolated incidents and ongoing review, but found himself relegated to the periphery of his own press conference. The city's narrative had been decisively rewritten, not through political maneuvering, but through the methodical application of truth backed by power. Miller and Ramirez watched from the transport vehicle, their expressions shifting from defiance to dawning comprehension, as the machinery they had trusted to protect them instead ensured their accountability. Before departing, Colonel Holloway delivered a final statement that would appear in headlines nationwide. "Today, justice was possible because of who I am. Tomorrow, we begin the work of making justice possible regardless of who your father is." He placed his arm around Marcus's shoulders, no longer the commanding officer, but simply a parent protecting his child. As they descended the steps, phones throughout the crowd displayed notifications of an emergency city council meeting called for that evening. The story had transcended a single incident, becoming instead the catalyst for a reckoning long overdue. Behind them, Commissioner Reynolds already stood in deep conversation with Sergeant Willis, whose decision to send evidence had created the first crack in the wall of silence. 6 months later, Marcus stood at the podium in the Police Academy auditorium, the scar on his cheekbone barely visible beneath the professional lighting. 120 police cadets sat before him in perfect rows, their expressions a mixture of deference and discomfort. Behind them sat current officers fulfilling mandatory retraining, among them Sergeant Willis, now promoted to lieutenant and head of the department's new Community Oversight Division. Marcus adjusted the microphone, his Westridge Academy blazer replaced by a tailored suit bearing the emblem of the Holloway Justice Initiative. College acceptance letters had arrived last week, but those celebrations could wait. This moment mattered more. "My name is Marcus Holloway," he began, the same introduction he'd given 67 times in precincts across 3 states. 6 months ago, I was walking home when officers decided I didn't belong in my own neighborhood. No longer did his voice carry the shock of fresh trauma. Experience had transformed his testimony into something more powerful, a precision instrument wielded with his father's strategic discipline. On the screen behind him, the now familiar footage played, no longer as painful to watch. Marcus had learned that repeated exposure dulled personal anguish while sharpening its impact on others. The cadet's discomfort was the point, the beginning of necessary change. In the back row, Colonel Holloway observed with measured pride. His Pentagon position remained, but 3 days each week now belonged to this program, a condition he'd negotiated with the Joint Chiefs after declining a promotion that would have limited his availability. The military had recognized the public relations value of supporting his initiative, especially as former officers Miller and Ramirez began serving their 3-year sentences last month. Captain Hargrove had received probation in exchange for testimony about departmental practices. His career effectively ended, but his cooperation ensuring others would face consequences. Commissioner Reynolds had resigned his position to join the Holloway Initiative full-time, finding redemption in dismantling the system he had helped maintain. "Today you'll participate in simulations designed by trauma specialists and civil rights attorneys," Marcus continued, gesturing to Washington and her team positioned at training stations. "Throughout the room, you'll experience split-second decisions from civilian perspectives before returning to your law enforcement roles." The program's innovation lay in this reversal, forcing officers to physically occupy the position of the policed, complete with psychological triggers and physiological stress responses. Early data showed a 40% reduction in excessive force incidents among graduated participants. Critics called it sensitivity theater, but body camera statistics told a different story. The Oak Hill neighborhood where Marcus had been assaulted had transformed most dramatically. Property values initially plummeted following national coverage of the incident, prompting wealthy residents to establish a community foundation aimed at rebuilding public trust. Their first action, removing the private security service that had encouraged aggressive police patrols, was followed by funding for youth programs and community spaces that actively welcomed residents from surrounding areas. Self-preservation had motivated their initial response, but something more meaningful had emerged in the months since. Genuine connection across boundaries previously maintained through fear and separation. "Officer Rivera, you'll begin today's first simulation," Marcus announced, calling forward a cadet whose application essay had revealed a childhood in foster care. "Lieutenant Willis will observe." As the training groups formed, Colonel Holloway quietly joined his son at the podium. Their physical resemblance had strengthened during Marcus's recovery, not just in features, but in the contained power of their movements and the evaluating patience in their gaze. Catherine would have recognized the transformation, James thought, not for the first time. She would have understood how trauma could forge purpose, how justice work required the same disciplined focus as military operations. Marcus had found unexpected allies beyond official channels. The teen who filmed the initial arrest had created a verification app allowing citizens to submit incident footage directly to oversight committees, bypassing department servers. Westridge Academy now required students to complete community service within city youth programs rather than comfortable charities in distant countries. Marcus's basketball teammates had initially responded with awkward sympathy, but education transformed discomfort into advocacy. Each small shift represented a defensive position reinforced, another strategic objective secured in the larger campaign. "Your father would have been proud," James said quietly as cadets moved toward their stations. Marcus allowed himself a small smile at the familiar words. They both knew the statement contained layers, pride not just in surviving injustice, but in transforming it into systemic change. Marcus had declined countless media appearances in favor of direct work with departments willing to reform. The approach reflected James's military philosophy. Change required both public pressure and private transformation of institutional culture. Headlines faded, but properly trained officers made daily decisions affecting countless lives. As training commenced, Marcus circulated among the groups, observing exchanges between civilians and officers role-playing tense encounters. Washington caught his eye from across the room, giving a subtle nod toward Lieutenant Willis, who was demonstrating proper de-escalation techniques to a cluster of veteran officers. The system couldn't heal from centuries of embedded bias through 6 months of reforms, but crucial surgery had begun. Marcus touched the fading scar on his cheek, a habit he'd developed during recovery. The mark would always remain, a permanent reminder of both vulnerability and strength. Some wounds never disappeared completely, but they could become something else. Evidence of survival, testament to resilience, catalyst for transformation. Before I go on, I would really appreciate it if you give this video a like, click the subscribe button down below. It would really encourage me to create more videos for you. Thank you so much. Alright, let's continue. Colonel Holloway watched his son navigate the room with natural authority, interacting with equal ease among attorneys, officers, and civilian participants. The boy who'd been forced face down on concrete had emerged as someone stronger, more purposeful than before, not because of the trauma but despite it. James recognized the quality from battlefields across the world, the unbreakable dignity of those who refused to be defined by what was done to them, choosing instead to reshape the world that allowed such injuries. As Marcus caught his eye from across the room, James offered a crisp nod, officer to officer, father to son, acknowledging a mission well conducted, with many operations still to come.